In 1985, there was a small splash in national newspapers about a fugitive turning himself into federal authorities. It wasn't a lot of press given that he had been a federal fugitive, one of the most wanted men in the nation for 40 years. But was most surprising was not just that he was able to avoid an FBI manhunt for 4 decades. What was really most surprising about the man named Georg Gärtner was his crime. Georg Gärtner was an escaped German prisoner of war. And the story of his life on the lam is history that deserves to be remembered. Georg Gärtner was born in the town of Schweidnitz in what was then the Prussian province of Lower Silesia in 1920. Schweidnitz was a town of about 35,000, a relatively rural and remote part of the post-World War I Weimar Republic, perhaps best known as the childhood home of the famous fighter pilot ace Manfred von Richthofen. The son of a railroad official, Gärtner was an accomplished athlete who had won local championships in tennis and skiing, and a proficient student who dreamed of becoming an architect. However, a near-fatal bout of diphtheria at the age of 15 prevented his graduating Oberrealschule, essentially high school. By 1940, Germany was engrossed in war, and with few prospects outside of war, he volunteered to join the army. There he faced more health issues, first pneumonia and then a training injury, and it was nearly 2 years before he could get a combat assignment. He was not able to apply directly to be an officer because of his failure to graduate Oberrealschule, but distinguished himself enough to be promoted to KOB, a designation meaning War Officer Candidate. He attended officer preparatory school and then was sent to a combat unit as a sergeant. After serving enough time in combat, he could be called back to finish officer training and become an officer. Finally ready for service in 1942, he saw a poster calling for volunteers for the Afrika Korps. Commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Nazi propaganda had portrayed the Afrika Korps as ever-victorious heroes, and Rommel as an undefeatable legend. Gärtner from rural Silesia was excited about the prospect of adventure, of travel, of certain glory with the vaunted Afrika Korps, and of course, of warm weather. Having been a skiing champion, and even having instructed German troops in cross-country skiing, he had a very real chance of being assigned to the brutal Eastern Front, so volunteering for service in Africa seemed the best alternative. Gärtner arrived in Libya in January of 1943, only to find that the military situation did not match the propaganda. After their defeat the previous November at the hands of the British 8th Army in the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Afrika Korps was in headlong retreat. Gärtner's first dose of reality came when the airfield at which he landed was shelled by British artillery less than an hour after he arrived, and 3 days later, that airfield was in Allied hands. Gärtner, a sergeant in an artillery unit of the 15th Panzer Division, had arrived just in time to participate in a grueling, hopeless desert battle in which the Afrika Korps was retreating as much as 50 miles a day. Rommel was called back to Germany. The Afrika Korps was cornered, and the following May the young sergeant became one of some 220,000 German and Italian soldiers of the African campaign forced to surrender. Only the week before he had received his orders to return to Germany to complete his officer's training, but of course by then escape was impossible. In his memoir, he recalled, upon being taken to an American camp, how well equipped the Americans were, noting the nonchalance with which they let their engines idle without any concern for a shortage of fuel. He concluded, "At that moment, I realized that we would lose the war." Most of the prisoners captured in North Africa were taken to prisoner of war camps in the United States. There were many reasons to ship the prisoners to the U.S. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners be kept safe and fed. That was relatively easy to do in the U.S., but nearly impossible in North Africa. Keeping prisoners near the war zone, say in France, would mean that escaped prisoners had a reasonable chance of returning to their own lines and rejoining the fight. That was much harder to do from New Jersey or New Mexico. Britain was facing a significant housing shortage and so had asked the U.S. for assistance. Enlisted prisoners of war could be compelled to work, although according to the rules of the Geneva Convention, they had to be compensated. And the U.S. had need of extra labor, particularly farm labor, with so many of its own fighting in the war. Finally, Germany and Italy would eventually hold nearly 100,000 U.S. POWs during the war. While they were also bound by, and generally followed, the rules of the Geneva Convention, the Germans held in the U.S. were, essentially, a guarantee of good care for Allied prisoners held by the Axis. U.S. Liberty ships were arriving daily with supplies and reinforcements, so prisoners were simply put on the ships for their return voyage, although that placed them at risk of sinking by their own U-boats. Georg Gärtner was now off on another adventure, taken on one of those Liberty ships in June. The man from a small town in Silesia, where most people would never see more than 50 miles from home, was now on his way to the United States. He did have an advantage over most of his fellow POWs. In school he had studied English and spoke the language passably. German POWs in the United States have been called nearly forgotten history. Eventually some 450,000 Germans and 51,000 Italian prisoners of war were kept in the United States. There were over 700 POW camps in 46 states. Still, Americans were largely unaware of the camps, which by rule were kept away from urban areas and industrial centers for security purposes. And there was an imperative to build the camps in areas where the climate was mild to reduce construction costs, so many of the camps were in the South. Gärtner was moved between camps in Texas and New Mexico, eventually winding up at a camp outside the small town of Deming, New Mexico. German POWs in the United States were treated well. Gärtner noted that the food was not just better than they'd had in the German army, but generally better than what the American public was getting in the time of rationing. Camps offered athletics, books, movies, and college courses, and even occasionally alcohol or beer at the camp canteen, paid in the script that prisoners got for work. Gärtner mentioned that there were risks of confrontation with the guards, but a larger risk of confrontation with a few hardcore Nazis in the camp, and in Texas and New Mexico, an occasional risk of running into rattlesnakes. The largest problem, he recalled, was boredom. While German POWs did occasionally escape, as many as a couple thousand over the course of the war, they were almost always caught within the first 24 hours. Generally non-political and happy to be out of the war, Georg was not the type of prisoner who would even consider escape. But that changed in 1945. The war in Europe ended in May, and the POWs began to wonder at how they would be repatriated. Camp conditions declined as the U.S. POWs were coming home, and the U.S. no longer had to worry about their treatment of German POWs to guarantee the treatment of Allied POWs. 2. The guards had become more hostile as concentration camps were becoming liberated in Europe, and the extent of the horrors of the Holocaust were coming clear. According to Gärtner, most of the POWs were as shocked and repelled as the Americans, but the guards became more openly hostile as a result. Worst of all, the POWs found out in the summer of 1945, the U.S. planned to eventually repatriate them directly to their hometowns. They'd hoped to be released in the American zone in Germany, a daunting enough prospect given the devastation and shortages following the war. But for POWs like Gärtner, being directly repatriated meant sending them to territories now occupied by the Soviet Union, where Gärtner suspected he would not be treated as well as he had been in the United States. What's more, Georg Gärtner simply wanted freedom. He had gone from the regimented society of Germany to the German army to the POW camp. At the age of 24, he wanted for the first time in his life to feel free to make his own choices. He became determined to escape. When he had attended officers' preparatory school in Germany, they had done an exercise where the students had pretended to be escaped prisoners. Their instructors dropped them off on one side of town, and they had to make it to the other side without being caught by their instructors. While the other students came up with elaborate plans, sneaking through sewers or across rooftops, Gärtner had chosen a simple and direct approach. He simply pretended to be a normal citizen, caught a streetcar, and was across town ahead of his instructors. He was the only student to successfully make it. His plan on September 24th, 1945 was also simple. He could see a train track from the camp. He studied the schedule, and one night when the rest of the camp was watching a movie, he waited for a break in the searchlights, crawled under 2 sets of wire, and ran for the train. He hopped on and rode in a freight car the same way many people rode at the time, and the train took him to San Pedro, California. The train turned out to be a stroke of luck. As soon as he was found missing at bed check, there was a massive search. The army interrogated the other prisoners, but he hadn't revealed his plans to any of them. The army guessed that he would lie low in the area and concentrated their search in New Mexico. It does not seem to have occurred to them that he might have ridden off on the train. As another stroke of luck, the FBI considered his escape to be the Army's problem, and it was another year before they started a nationwide manhunt. By that time, he'd improved his English and learned to part his hair and hold his fork like an American. In the booming multicultural California that followed the Second World War, he was able to blend in, lay low, and learn how to become an American. At first, he traveled with migrant farm workers, itinerant jobs where a few questions were asked. He claimed to be a Norwegian immigrant named Peter Peterson. He later took the name Dennis Wiles, derived from the names of a migrant farm worker family he had met. He was eventually able to acquire a Social Security card and then a driver's license under that name. He worked as a salesman, as a ski instructor, and as a tennis pro. At one point he played tennis doubles with actor Lloyd Bridges and palled around at a ski lodge with Robert Stack. When the passenger train City of San Francisco was trapped in an avalanche in the Sierra Nevada mountains in January 1952, as the head of the ski patrol for a local ski area, he was the first to reach the train. A blurry photo of him ran in papers nationwide, even while another photo of him on wanted posters hung in post offices nationwide. After repatriation, only 15 of the nearly 450,000 German POWs in the United States were unaccounted for. One by one, they had all been found. After a merchant seaman named Kurt Richard Westphal was found in West Germany in 1964, Gärtner was the last missing German POW. The FBI had run out of leads. They were reduced to searching phone books to find names close to Georg Gärtner. One way that Dennis Wiles managed to avoid capture for 4 decades was that he never shared his secret with anyone. In 1964, he married a divorcee named Jean Clark. After 18 years of marriage, she still did not know his real name. In the end, it was his wife that convinced him to come clean. She had finally become exasperated with his unwillingness to talk about his past, and when he refused to travel with her internationally and wouldn't say why, in reality he didn't have a birth certificate so he couldn't get a passport, she decided it was time to leave him. She'd packed her bags and called a cab, and it was in that moment that he realized that he had to tell her the truth, the first person to which he had told his terrible secret in 37 years. His wife then took control of the situation. She found a historian named Arnold Kramer, who had authored a book on German POWs in the United States, and Kramer agreed to co-author a book detailing Gärtner's story. It is called Hitler's Last Soldier in America. She then hired an attorney to manage his turning himself over to authorities. He concluded his book saying, "How lucky I am to have her." After searching for him for nearly 40 years, the FBI decided they weren't interested anymore. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even clear he committed a crime, since his escape had come technically after the war had ended. Similarly, the Immigration and Naturalization Service decided to pursue no charges. Since he had been brought to the United States against his will as a prisoner of war, he hadn't entered the country illegally, and having been married to a U.S. citizen for 18 years, Gene could petition for his citizenship. After his book was finally published in 1985, he went on the Today Show, September 11, 1985, and officially surrendered to Bryant Gumbel. The United Press International headline for the day was, "World War II finally came to an end today." He later found out that his sister was still alive in Germany and had managed to immigrate from East Germany to West Germany and was able to go visit her. Because of bureaucratic delays, he didn't become a naturalized citizen until 2009. Georg Gärtner, or Dennis Wiles, whichever name you prefer, passed away in 2013, the age of 92. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.